Hello, everybody, and welcome to Positive Fandom. I am your host, Mmmm, and today we have with us Kamran Pasha. Kamran, how are you today?
I'm doing well. It's always a delight to be on your channel, and I want to let people know we're going to have some interesting things coming up in the future. Some interesting conversations about things like Planet of the Apes that I think have been recorded and can be shared. So it's always delightful to be talking with you.
Oh, thank you, Cameron. And I feel the same way about you. You certainly have opened up my mind to a lot of questions that I have about screenwriting, screenplay writing, and cinema and themes. A lot of very interesting things. It's so enjoyable. So thank you for being here today. And of course, Cameron, you're here today with me to review one of the most profound movies ever made,
Yeah.
the 1976 The Message film, which is a film that focuses on the Prophet Muhammad and the message that the Prophet Muhammad brought to the entire world.
hmm
Cameron, I have to say, I had not known about this movie until you had brought it to my attention. And it was made in 1976, let's say 77, whatever the
Yeah.
year says. But I'm noticing, was Hollywood more open to making these types of historical and religious films at that time?
Well, Hollywood has always been open to historical and religious films. I mean, it was founded on them. And going back to the silent film era, I mean, we often forget that the Ten Commandments that we think of Charlton Heston is a remake. It was a remake of a silent film, also done by Cecil B. DeMille. Right? He made that film in the 1920s, right? And at the time, I mean, the splitting the Red Sea, all those things were special effects beyond anything people could have imagined. And so Hollywood has been making these kinds of historical epics, making religious epics. Not just the Ten Commandments. There's been many movies about Jesus, including The Robe and others. And so that's been part of Hollywood legacy. It's changed in the recent years because in for most of Hollywood's journey, these movies have been quite respectful and reverential of the spiritual traditions that they're presenting. And in the last few years, again, we've been in this bizarre decade of strange moments and changes. So there's been these new movies. That there was a Ridley Scott Moses movie that came out. I think of Kings and Prophets. I think it was that the name, or was that the, I'm just remembering the title of it, but it was a movie that came out that tried to present the Moses story in a more scientific, rational way. That everything that happened was because all the miracles were all part of actual natural phenomenon that were misunderstood perhaps by people as miracles. And then you had Darren Aronofsky's Noah and all these things. They're being made by people's perspectives who are not. They themselves are not believers. Ridley Scott is very open about the fact that he's an atheist, and I think people are approaching it recently with more of a critique of using these religious stories to critique religion itself, and they have not been successful. And to the surprise of the people making them, that these are meaningful stories for people, and once you undermine them, you'll get an audience of people that already don't believe in the underlying message, but then those people don't show up because they don't care about the underlying message at all. So you've lost the people that believe in the fundamental story, the mythos, if you'd like, of that particular religious story, and people who don't care about it. And then, you've lost everyone. And so those movies weren't successful. So that's a bizarre moment that we've been going through, which I think will reset itself now because it's just not profitable. But with regard to this, Hollywood has never, ever, ever done a movie about the birth of Islam. And we'll talk about the variety of reasons why that is the case. This is the only time this has ever been done. And it is specifically because one man spearheaded this vision. And it's literally decades ahead of his time because it's never been done since. Right, 1977, and the filmmaker behind this movie, The Message, was Mustafa Akkad, who was an absolute pioneer. He was a Syrian filmmaker, I believe, from Damascus, who had come and studied at UCLA, I believe, here in Los Angeles, in the 60s and 70s, and decided I want to become a Hollywood guy, right? And this guy, I talk about being one of the first Muslims in Hollywood. This guy was the first, or at least one of the first directors to actually care about it, right? And he championed this film, and we'll talk about the process of how it was made and then the content of it. But he put this out there. And what's interesting about Mr. Akkad is that he's a major part of Hollywood for another reason. He was the producer of the first Halloween. He's the owner of the Halloween franchise. So it's
Oh,
hard to imagine Mustafa Akkad, who makes this incredibly powerful spiritual movie. He made Halloween, and his family still controls the rights to Halloween. So every single Halloween movie that's made after that is an Akkad production. The most recent Hollywood movies, which I have not liked, and I'm a big fan of the franchise, were also being produced by his son Malik Akkad, who I've met a couple of times. So his family is very much known to Hollywood for Halloween, but to the entire Islamic world for this project. And for another one that we'll talk about, Lion of the Desert, that's not religion, but it's more so on anti-colonial history, right? And Anthony Quinn
Yes.
stars in that one too.
Yes, and it is very interesting. And I kind of did. I'm so glad that you said a lot of these things here as we're kind of introducing this topic, introducing this film, which is just absolutely incredible, Cameron. One of the best films I've ever watched. And to be honest with you, initially I thought it would be good. Well, first of all, the message is lovely. So there's that.
Yeah,
But I also thought it was going to be a good production because Anthony Quinn is in it. And to be honest with you, Cameron, I've noticed that, and he's not the only Hollywood actor that takes on very specific films with religious meaning. But I have noticed that Anthony Quinn thrives in roles that are somewhat unpopular and are challenging in Hollywood. He likes to be depicted in these roles of individuals who have made a huge difference. For me, my favorite one of his is Barabbas, okay? Sure. But he's made so many others, the Something of the Fisherman, of course, I think the Something of Navarone, which also stars the same woman who's in this film. I think her name is Irene Pappas. Both of them, The Guns of Navarone, I think they were both in a lot of films that I think maybe a lot of stars were not raising their hands to be in, but they saw the significance and maybe the legacy that the film would have for generations to come. And so there was a desire to be involved in a project like this, which, as you said, let's say, at least in the Western world, hasn't been repeated for a number of reasons. Cameron, I have to say, and I saw the length of the film and I said, okay, I've watched 3-hour films before, but I had no idea. It is true. Now this is historical fact of what happens in this film. So this is not a question about, whether any of this stuff happened. It's certainly not that, but gee, this film is great to watch, Cameron.
It's a great movie. One does not have to be a believer in this religion to enjoy this movie as a work of art. It's a cinematic masterpiece. It's up there with the 10 Commandments, and most people have never heard of it.
Yes, it certainly is up there with the 10 Commandments. And there are very specific things that I like about it. And so, Cameron, one of the things about it, of course, this is about the Muslim religion. So there are some very specific things that the director could and could not do. And that was to show an image of the prophet. And I think it was very important in a very clever way, Cameron. You had said that they would do this. And there are points where the characters are speaking to the prophet. And it's so interesting, Cameron. They're looking right at the camera, right at you. You're the omniscient individual who I guess might be behind the prophet, so to speak. And of course, the look in their eyes when you realize what they've decided to do in this film, it's just wonderful. I found myself thinking to myself, are they going to look at you again? Or, at what point are they going to come by? It really made you have to pay attention in a different way, because there are some pretty significant situations where we do hear what the prophet has said to one person, but then it's all of a sudden on direct right to you as the person is speaking to the prophet, who's obviously, as I said, in front of you, and you're kind of behind this whole thing. It was just so incredible. What a way to engage the public into an extraordinary event. You feel like you were part of this event, Cameron.
Well, you've hit the pivotal thing, because people were worried, like, how are you going to do this movie, right? And in fact, unfortunately, when initially word came out in the movie, there was a lot of unhappiness in the Muslim world, because people were ready to riot, and sadly, few people did when the movie came out without having seen it, because they assumed the Prophet Muhammad would be shown in it. So, for those who don't know, that it is largely a tenet of Muslim civilization that you don't show the Prophet. Iconography in general wasn't part of early Islamic art. As a result, we use calligraphy and other forms of geometry, and because the idea is iconography was seen as promoting idol worship. Like, you can't have an idol if you don't have an image, you don't have an idol. And this is not necessarily just Islam. It's certainly not just Islamic. This is rooted in ancient Judaism, where for very long periods of time in Israelite religion, you could not have any kind of iconography well into the time of Jesus, right? And that now that we're doing a lot of archaeological work in Jerusalem, you're finding all this stuff from the Jewish community of the time, first century, and it's all this incredible art. But it's all geometric, right? But there's also others that have pictorial design. It was a divide in the Jewish community, right? And similarly in Christianity, and actually around the same time period, around the 6th and 7th centuries, when Islam appears, in Christianity was going through the exact same thing. So if you've been to the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Constantinople as it was once called, that was founded as the largest Christian basilica on earth until modern times, and it was built in the 400s. When the Muslims conquered the city, it was purchased and by the Mehmed the Conqueror we talked about last time, and he turned it into a mosque. But what's fascinating is that he preserved. There's all these incredibly beautiful, images of Jesus and Mary throughout them, but they preserved them. They just covered them up because they wanted to be able to worship without iconography, but they didn't destroy them. What's fascinating is that there were other parts of the Hagia Sophia's art that had already been destroyed. Because the Byzantines went through what is called the iconoclastic period, where they also believed that imagery was a violation of "Thou shalt not have graven images" in the Bible, right? And so they destroyed their own Christian art. And so, how are you going to show the Prophet Muhammad when iconography in general is suspect, right? And then there was, even when Muslims started doing paintings, especially out of Iran, the most beautiful artistic representations come out of Iran and Persian culture. There was a large consensus in the Muslim world, civilizationally and amongst artists, that you don't show the Prophet. That he didn't want to be looked, he didn't want to be seen, certainly didn't want to be worshipped, and he didn't want to be the center of it. Right? This religion is actually not about him. One of the central things is it's about God. He is the messenger or the final prophet of God in the Islamic perspective, but it isn't about him. And the Quran is very clear. There's a verse in the Quran that tells the people of the time who are revering him as the prophet, it says, what if he dies or is killed? Is that going to, as you're going to turn your back because you're worshiping him? That doesn't, he's human. He's going to die. So God doesn't need you. So put your intent. The religion will happen with or without you. And when he passed away, there was a lot of confusion and chaos in the community because they were shocked that the prophet had died. He was so central to them, and that his best friend came out and said, "If anyone worships Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead. This day was coming." Right? If anyone worships God, know that God lives forever. Right? And so the prophet did not want to be the center of that. He certainly didn't want to be represented. And so, how do you make a movie? How do you make a movie where the main character, the one spreading the message, which is what the title of the movie is, how do you do it? Well, and Mustafa Khad in 1970s came up with this ingenious thing: we'll make the camera the prophet's point of view. So he'll never be on screen because he's looking out. And that actually has a profound theological meaning as well, which is that this religion isn't about one man. Because the entire movie, it's this epic movie. There's hundreds of characters, right? And it's all about them and about how this message affects their lives and the choices that they make as a result of it, right? The story isn't about the prophet at all. It's about he's a catalyst for their lives. And that's sort of how Muslims see it. And so this was this remarkable artistic choice, which in the subsequent years, in the decades, since Hollywood has never done a movie about the prophet again, they may never do it unless maybe I get a chance to do it, right? And so, but in the Islamic world, after this taboo was broken of doing a movie set in the prophet's lifetime, there have been productions throughout the Muslim world, in Iran and the Arabic-speaking languages, that and even Pakistan that show these figures, but the prophet is never shown. And they use the techniques that Mustafa Khad invented. Right, there's wonderful animated films. Again, the prophet is never shown because even in the animated films he becomes the camera. So this one man created an artistic motif that is pretty much going to be how Islamic civilization is going to handle this moving forward throughout history. This guy is like, how do I solve this? This is how I solve it, and he created an entire artistic motif as a result.
Yeah, it is just so cleverly done. It is incredibly engaging. I felt like I was involved in it. You can't but feel that way, Kamran, because the actors are speaking to you directly. So it really was beautiful, honestly. And
they're very engaged. Literally they're talking to the screen. Right.
Yes, and I thought that was one of the most beautiful things about it. And I should say that what we're talking about was not just one event, but let's say an individual and this message that changed the entire world. So this isn't sort of just I actually want to kind of quantify it. It's difficult to quantify because it has had such a profound effect over the entire world. So
and again, one does not have to be a believer in the religion to understand that this religion is now the second largest religion in the world, and there's a huge swath of humanity that is majority Muslim, from North Africa all the way into Eastern Europe, into the Middle East, into India, into Southeast Asia, and the largest Muslim population is actually Southeast Asia, which is surprising to people, right? The Indonesia is the largest Muslim country, and so this is a substantial part of humanity. And so this movie is important to understand the event, certainly as Muslims see it, because obviously if you're not a Muslim, you may not be as reverential to these figures, right? That's fine. But it's important to understand this is how 20-25% of humanity sees this history. And that you need to understand that.
And Cameron, I do kind of also want to look at, so we're not also just talking about the message and the prophet. We're also talking about the history of the Islamic world.
Yes.
And I think that to put it into context, we can't get every bit of information about what the history of the Islamic world is. Just that this is one of the major events that happened during that time. So I also want to say something that I feel is very important as well, is that there was a sense of religion already present. And the situation that the prophet and this message is delivered in are already to individuals who are practicing different religions, Cameron. And we see this, we see that the message is spread. And this is no different from any other situation where you would have someone who is a religious individual who would be, let's say, reciting beliefs to another person. And I think that context, the desire to spread the message here was done so nicely. There was sort of a dispatch that's sent out initially, Kamran, and we get to see the leaders of surrounding kingdoms, if you will. And how nicely it's done. These leaders, this is, of course, a dramatization of perhaps their reaction, but, they got a message from someone who was given them this message from, let's say, Muhammad, who had heard it from the angel Gabriel. And so, once they hear this, I think that these leaders, and as I said, we have some wonderful actors who depicted all of these different leaders who got the message, but it is very interesting to see their different reactions. I'm sure when they read this, you don't get a message like that every day, do you, Kamran?
Well, I mean, that's the movie really establishes a historical moment, right? Which is a unique historical moment, because at this point, there's lively religious stuff happening in 7th century, right? So you've got Christianity is a dominant religion in the Middle East. Everything that we would consider the Middle East today, which is Syria, Egypt, they were all Christian. They were all Greek Christian, right? Byzantine Christian, and you had Judaism had largely been expelled from the Holy Land by the Romans, and so the Jews had scattered. But there was a substantial group of Jews in Arabia at the time. They had resettled there, and then Arabia itself had one of the sort of last remnants of what Muslims would call idolatry, but they were a polytheistic tradition, right? They were a polytheistic tradition, one of sort of the last remnants of old shamanistic polytheism. There's still elements of that throughout the world, but and it's sort of distinct from other traditions that at least on the surface may appear polytheistic. Hinduism can be presented as polytheistic, but there's a lot of thousands of years of scriptures and a lot of very mysticism and concepts of, all these gods are just manifestations of the one God. So there's a concept of monotheism very much at the heart of Hinduism, whereas this was very much an old school polytheistic tradition. Allah, the Arabic word, the Arabic word for God, Allah literally means the God, and so Allah was the creator God, sort of the Zeus of the pantheon, right? And then you had all these goddesses who were his daughters, and then all these other beings that were forces of nature, right? And so this was very much, this kind of tradition had largely died out with the rise of Christianity, because the sort of Greco-Roman religion had been eclipsed by this time, right? But Arabia still had this. And frankly, it was a very primitive version of that. I mean, even the Greeks created wonderful works of philosophy and art and all that with that tradition. The Arabs hadn't. And this was a disorganized world. There was no central government. It was essentially, it was what we would consider Somalia today, just tribal warlords, right? Nobody in charge. There's no government. There's no court system. There's no justice system. Justice is whatever you can seize with your hand. So the mighty rule, right? And the weak, it's too bad for you, right? And so that's the world that the Prophet Muhammad is born into, and that's where this message comes. Christianity hasn't penetrated. There's a few Christian Arabs. There were some Christian Arabs in Mecca at the time the Prophet arrived. One in particular who endorsed him, said, I believe you're getting a real revelation from Gabriel. But the Arabs just resisted Christianity. They had no interest in it. There were some Arab tribes that converted to Judaism, but it still wasn't that popular. And so they just had their traditions. and they were, because they were old school desert things. The people who had gone to Arabia had left there to leave behind the civilizations of the time. They left the Roman Empire, right? They left the grand Coptic empires of Africa. They left all that behind because they were just sort of independent, libertarian type. Leave me alone. I'm gonna do my own thing. I'm gonna go to the desert where nobody can tell me what to do, right?
Yes,
And so
yes,
as a result, they're very stubborn people, and they had their gods and their religions, and they're like, I'm leaving the Christian world so I can go keep my old school traditions alive, because they're no longer, a lot of the gods that were in Mecca were actually old Syrian gods that had been eclipsed by when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So they all said, oh, okay, well, I don't want to break down my idol of my god, Hubal. I'm going to take him down to Mecca where there's no government, so nobody's going to tell me what to do. So these
right.
people were very stubborn, and they were resistant to any kind of ethical religious tradition, because their religion wasn't based on ethics. It was more shamanistic, right? And so it led to a very unhappy social situation in this environment, right? And that's where the movie shows that.
And something, and we everybody knows and has heard of Mecca. This is not a city you have not heard of. Even in modern times, it makes the news a lot. But it's interesting to think of what it was like so long ago, Kamran. And I like this snapshot of it. It's a thriving place. People want to be there. There's a lot of history there. People feel very attached to Mecca. And, I think that was also very interesting, that even before the events of the message, there is this desire to be there, to go there, and ironically, it almost feels like there's a fight over the place, more or less, Kamran. After there is this, I'm not going to say it's a disagreement. They are debating as to what the future is going to be, how, let's say, Islam is going to play in their lives. This is how I kind of look at that entire community, trying to figure out, something incredible has just happened. And now that this thing has happened, it's changed me. It's changed the entire environment. And I really love how it's shown in that way. Of course, there are going to be people who will say, well, no, I'm not doing that, and it was beautiful to see the Prophet's followers, especially what they do is, as you said, we don't see the Prophet, because that's not what this film does. But what we do get is a hint at some aspects of his life. For example, we learn he has an adopted son, he has a wife,
Zayd,
and he has a family, and they're very close, and they're all concerned about him after him, and I don't have all of the exact details, but he has this experience where he is meditating. I'm guessing that's what it is, Kamran. He is
he would go out to the wilderness and and just escape, because this is a thriving metropolitan city in the desert with nobody in charge, right? It's the libertarian. I'm a libertarian, so it's a sort of what a libertarian might consider paradise, right? There's nobody in charge, and it was there, and he would go out to this desert, to this mountain, to just escape the materialism and the noise of Mecca. And that's where he has his first personal experience.
And so, the way that this happened, is accounted, is that the Prophet is visited by the angel Gabriel, as I had said before, and receives a message. And it's not sort of like a 5-minute message, is it, Kamran? This is something that, and I'm trying to, put it into a perspective. It's something that happens over a certain period of time, and they're actually worried about him as he's having these visitations, if you will. That's what I would call it. I don't know whether that's
that's fair. I mean, that's fair. Visitations, visions, and these. So one of the many things that connects Islam and Christianity, although not everyone is always happy with these connections, right? But one of the is that in Islam, the angel of revelation is the angel Gabriel, which is true in Christianity as well. Gabriel comes to Mary and tells her, just as in the Quran also has the same story. Gabriel comes to Mary and tells her, you will bear this miraculous child, right? And so the angel Gabriel appears to the Prophet in the desert, and he has this. It's only a momentary experience, but it's a life-changing experience where as he described it, the angel appears to him in the desert, what he's in this cave, and embraces him, and so he can't even breathe, and tightly and tells him to read, and the Prophet says, well, he can't read, he's illiterate, right? And that's when the central teachings of Islam is the Prophet Muhammad can't read, and so the miracle of Islam is the Quran, that a man who can't read or write produces this incredible book, right? And so so he can't read, and the Gabriel says to him, demands that he reads, and finally goes, well, what do you want me to read? I mean, I can't read. What do you want me to read? And he does the opening, sort of the first verses of the Quran, which are, read in the name of your Lord who created man from a alaq, which literally means like a clinging creature, the embryo. He created man from this tiny clinging embryo, and then it taught men what he did not know, taught them by the pen what they did not know. So that's the opening moment, and then he doesn't know what's happened to him, and he runs back home and tells his wife and then a few of his intimate family and friends what's happening to him. And then these incidences happen again and again, and he can't control when this happens. The angel will just appear, and it will be a very physical experience for him, where he'll fall over and
shaking
and all that. And scientists will, those who are not Muslims will say, oh, he's having epileptic trance, however you want to define it. He's having some kind of experience where he loses consciousness, comes out, and the verses of the Quran start coming out of his mouth. And this is an important thing theologically to understand. For Muslims, the Quran is not the word of Muhammad. And we don't think of that. When I open the book, I don't think for 1 second I'm hearing the prophet speaking. It's not even occurs to me, right? Because we have a whole corpus of literature, of oral accounts of the prophets saying, some of which are apocryphal, many of which are apocryphal, but some of which are authentic. And so we have that. That's called the hadith literature, the oral tradition of what the prophet said. And but the Quran for a Muslim is actually God himself speaking. The prophet is not the author in any way, shape, or form. He has no conscious control over it. It's literally, he's a telephone, and God is speaking through it. So when the Quran speaks, the Quran speaks from God's point of view. So it's always God speaking as I or we. Sometimes he uses sort of the royal we, sometimes he uses I, but it's never, and it's always addressing the prophet. It's always say, do this. It's always addressing him, commanding him. It's never from his point of view. And so that's how the Muslims are seeing. So they're seeing, to them, the people of Mecca are shocked here. What's happening here? This guy who's been, a respected member of the community, he's 40 years old at this time, and the backstory they go into, but he was an orphan who was poor, and but got a good reputation in the city as being an honest guy, and so he was hired by this wealthy widow, Khadija, who was a wealthy businesswoman, to run her businesses, run her caravans to Syria. And he was not only an honest man, he was a very successful businessman. He made her a lot of profit, and she was shocked that he, in a world where this is a pure mercantilist society, where buyer beware is what Mecca is based on, right? Sell what you can, and if you bought a lemon, that's your problem. That this honest man could make such success in business. And so she was so shocked by his character in this environment.
I'm sorry, Cameron, my computer crashed for a second.
Oh, okay, well, you're back. But yeah, so he was shocked by, she was shocked by his morality in an amoral environment, that she actually proposed marriage to him. She was his senior. She was an older woman than him, and she proposed marriage, and he was startled. And he's like, sure, of course, I'll marry you. So that's the background, is that he went from being this poor orphan to at least being a respected member of the society, because he married a wealthy woman, right? Who was an aristocrat. He wasn't. And so suddenly, and that's what everyone knows him at. Everyone calls him El Amin, the trustworthy one. And just if there's an honest guy, if you have a problem, go to Muhammad, he'll be honest about it, right? And then suddenly, 40 years into his life, when he's an established man, and this is a time where lifespan is about 50 years old, maybe, or you're lucky if you get to 50, right? So at this age of his life, suddenly this thing starts happening to him. And he's a respected member of the community who's never shown any evidence of artistic skill. He can't read or write. And the Quran is coming in the form of poetry. And suddenly this incredible poetry is coming out with this incredible rhythm and rhyme and meter. And he's never done that before. So people don't know what to make of this. I was a writer at the age of 6. I was telling short stories at 6. So suddenly a man who's shown no evidence of artistic ability suddenly spouts incredible poetry at the age of 40, startles them, and they don't know what's happening. So as you see, the movie starts going, well, what do we make of this? What's happening to us? Because he's a respected guy. We all trust him, but this is strange.
It is strange. And it would be strange if it was something that happened today, Kamran. And what is really wonderful to see is how his family is saying, well, what are we going to do? I'm very worried about him. Something has to be done. What's the next step? What's the right thing to do? I also kind of want to look at this from the same perspective. And you probably did say this, but we know what illiteracy is like in 2023, but we have no idea what it means to be illiterate at that time. What would it mean, just even in what you would be doing with your life, if you were an illiterate individual versus today, where I guess you could ask someone to read something for you or listen to something that's been transcribed. But at a time like that, what did that mean in regards to what you could do with your life? And does it mean that it would limit you? What does it mean exactly to be illiterate back then?
Yeah. So, literacy was a very rare phenomenon at that time. It's probably true worldwide, but certainly in Arabia, there were literate people. The Arabs had a very, the one thing they were proud of, it was not, again, it was not an artistic civilization, but they were very proud of their oral poetry tradition, right? And so when the Quran comes, it comes in the form of poetry, right? And the one thing that they recognize as something of social, of artistic value, and then challenges them to, the Quran is always challenging them, saying, well, can you make better poetry than this? And Muslims will certainly argue that you cannot, right? But so being illiterate also, it marks you as being a common man, because a few people, the wealthiest people in Mecca are the literate ones, right? And that's one of the reasons they're the wealthiest, right? Because they're able, and they're literate. It wasn't just literate in Arabic. They would often know how to speak Greek, right? And other languages, Coptic, which is the language of Egypt, right? And so that's because that's how they traded. And so so to be literate meant you were at the top of society. You were part of the oligarchy, right? And often the oligarchies, and we saw that in America with how slaves were treated, the oligarchy would make sure you're not allowed to read, right? And make sure, because slaves in the United States were not allowed to learn how to read. I mean, it was something that was prohibited to them, because they might become a threat if they become literate, right? And then to their shock, many of these were West Africans who were quite literate, who in their own languages, right? And so they didn't want to deal with that part, right? That these guys could speak 4 languages, right? Or read 4 languages. But whatever, that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, it reflects. So this is one of the things that's central to the Islamic message. The movie's called The Message. So the message is very much of universality. And so it is very important from an Islamic paradigm that the Prophet Muhammad has to be a common man. He comes from a poor family. They were from a respected lineage, but they were poor. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was 6 years old. His grandfather takes care of him. His grandfather dies when he's 10. And then his uncle takes care of him. So he's just loss after loss after loss. And in that crisis, there's no one taking care of him. So he doesn't learn how to read or write, right? He doesn't have the access to those things. He's just trying to survive. And he's an orphan wherever he goes. So he's just, he's going from one household to the other, just trying to find someone to take care of him, right? And so, so he comes from this impoverished orphan background, illiterate. He is very much of the oppressed classes of the time, right? And that's why Islam, it's very important that he comes from that, because it's someone like that can understand what the suffering of the average people are. So the earliest Islamic message, which they show in the movie, is very simple. It's just, there's one God. There's not all these other gods, all your Arab tribes, all your different deities, that you are worshiping to and sometimes sacrificing your children to. And future human sacrifice and especially a female infanticide were a real issue. Which is tragic, but it's true. That they were, Arab men, if a girl was born, and they thought a girl's a burden, they would just go out and bury her in the desert and go. And there was no problem with that. That's just, well, you didn't want a baby girl, you can kill her, right? And so the Prophet is seeing all of this, right? And because he's on the bottom of that society, and then this one major event happens in his life where he marries a rich woman at the top of the society, right? And so suddenly he goes from being at the bottom of the society to, in his mid-20s, having access to the higher elites and being in the rooms with these people, right? And now he can see how they think and their pathologies of how they want to keep the world unequal, right? But now he's amongst them, having come from the lower classes. So this is something that's one of the reasons he leaves Mecca and goes out to meditate so much, because he's disturbed. He's disturbed by the injustice all around him. And now that we all talk about getting in the 1%, he's allowed to walk in amongst the 1%, and he sees how bad they really are.
Yeah.
And they have no intention of creating an organized system of any kind to create justice or equity of any kind, right? And so this is something that, as a sensitive man, he's very sensitive. One of the things that the movie indicates, and it's very true, is that one of the critiques of the Prophet, he's a warrior, he's this and that, are not true to the character that we see in the vast biographies we have of him. It was shocking to the Arabs that he was actually, they would consider him very feminine. He was very gentle. He was not a macho man in a macho desert culture. He liked to cook, he liked to clean, he liked to mend his own shoes, and he preferred to spend his time with women. And often people say, wow, he was a lustful man, like being around women. No, it's because he was actually, women liked him. He was a very sensitive, gentle person, which was not common in this world, where everyone had to survive against the forces of nature. It's a desert, right? And so men had to be hard, and he wasn't that. And so here's a sensitive man suddenly seeing all this injustice, and now witness to the inner levels of society and how unjust it really is, it's very profoundly impactful. And I think the movie shows that.
I agree with you 100%. One thing that I did enjoy, and I don't know if it's true, but I still enjoyed it anyway, is that initially, of course, some of the elders were resistant to this entire message, let's say, when it feels a little bit more than a message, but I'm not even quite, I would call it a religious movement. That's how I would call it.
It is.
And the thing that I was really fascinated by was how the younger people seemed to need to hear this message. They were looking for something like this. I think that you're right. I think perhaps many of the people were set in their ways at Mecca, and there's no reason to change things. They got people coming and going. They're slaughtering, lambs and cows, and people are fine. There's no reason to change anything, and yet this movement resonated with the young people there, and to a point, which is not a surprise, they go home, they tell their parents, and their parents are not happy about this. And I really love seeing that level of interaction, because this is what we would expect would happen, where the parents would say, well, that's not how I raised you. You have to be, loyal.
You're disrespecting our gods. What's wrong with you?
Yes, you have to be loyal to our family, and our family, is kind of run this way, and that goes against what we're doing, and what you're doing is wrong. And so I really liked the notion of, let's say, a first group of people who decided that this was the way that they were going to live their lives, and they were kind of on the run. Cameron, I really like this. This is kind of exciting. I'm sure at the moment it must have been terrifying, but Cameron,
it was.
This was exciting to watch in the story of how they kind of collectively got together, and I could be incorrect in this, so correct me if I'm wrong. The prophet said, you've got to leave the area. It's not safe for you. And so they said, well, we're going to go to a place, and I kind of passed it. We're going to go to one of the neighboring countries where we know that there's a king who will give us refuge and will not kind of turn us into the bad guys. This is how I interpret it.
And the neighbor countries, Africa, they crossed the Red Sea to Ethiopia.
That's right. They went to Ethiopia, which is formerly called Abyssinia. And I really love the shot, Cameron.
You just missed it. They're right there.
I went too fast. I kind of lost my space here.
We're almost there.
I got excited, Cameron. You're so excited.
There's a lot of great visual imagery in there. And,
okay.
I think you just missed it again. There we are.
And so, this is so wonderful, Cameron, because there's several reasons why. I mean, I've been to Ethiopia. I did my research studies in Ethiopia for several years. So I know this place very well, and I know a lot about the history, but I didn't know about this particular part of the history, you see, because by the time I visited Ethiopia, there was, it's a place where at one time you had Christians, Jews, and Muslims all living together. And by the time I got there, they had already had Operation Exodus, which is
the Jews had largely left.
Yes. So now, that entire group, and for many, not all, but for many Ethiopians, they said that they lost a good portion of their history when that Exodus happened. They were, kind of upset about it, but there's still
Jews have been there since the days of Solomon. That's Ethiopian history. I mean, the Ethiopian royalty traces itself back to Solomon. He's the son of Solomon, and Queen Sheba is the king of Menelik, I believe is the name. So
that's right. It is
religion.
Menelik, I think the second. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it's Menelik the second. But what I was going to say is, what's really interesting about this, Cameron, is kind of and also correct me if I'm wrong on this. In the story, they said that group of young people, young believers, the first Islamic believers, went to Abyssinia for refuge, and it was not easy to get in. They had to kind of
cross the sea, and the Meccans were like, we can't let these people leave and spread this virus of this weird new religion, right? And then they sent people to grab them, and they had to escape under night while people were sent. If you resist, you die, right?
Yes, and
of course, the sea to do this.
It was incredibly dangerous. People came after them, and the king, here he is. This is not Menelik. This is the king.
He was called the Negus. The Negus was the title, so he was the Negus. Yes.
And what was so interesting is that he had said, and of course I'm not going to find. Oh yes, here it is. He had said what Christ says and what your Muhammad says, who's giving the message from God. So it's the message that Muhammad is delivering. I want to just say it correctly.
Yes.
Are like two rays from the same lamp. And I just really thought that was so beautiful because it was an acknowledgement of the beauty of the message.
Yeah.
And I think that this might have been the first time, at least in the movie, that we saw someone else acknowledge it.
And
And
who is a Christian, and he remains a
yes,
Christian, right?
well, yes,
And,
even if he wasn't a Christian, I mean, should someone else acknowledge it of how important it was? And so I think that that moment, you know, and yes, he's a Christian, but let's say if he wasn't even a Christian, it was important for those young followers to see this.
yeah. So let me give you a little bit of context of just the politics of the world, which explains why Islam is even, why people even are even having a problem, right? Right? Why is there a problem? And so you got a new religion, one God. I mean, who cares, right? They know Christians are around who have one God, Jews have one God. Why is this a problem? That the Prophet Muhammad shows up and says, I am a prophet of the lineage of the biblical prophets, spreading the one God message to you. So what? This is an idea that's floating around Arabia. The problem is this, is that Mecca is not, the reason Mecca is a commercial central point of Arabia was because it was a central pilgrimage site.
Yes, so, I do want to hear more about this.
Yeah, and I'm going to connect that here to what we're talking about.
I don't know as much about that as I should. So yeah. Please.
So Mecca, you said this was the Arabs were just scattered over this vast desert, right, with no central government of any kind. Every tribe for themselves, but they had one unifying thing. They had all their own different gods, right? But the one unifying thing was they had this shrine, this cubicle shaped structure in Mecca called the Kaaba, which means a cube. They had this shrine. I think you have some photos of it, right?
Yeah, I have.
How they recreated there. Yeah, they recreated. Kaaba looks a little different now, but that's what it would have looked like.
Yes, of course, since it's been built up over the centuries and everything.
Yeah. And so, but that's what it would realistically would have looked like at the time. And so this shrine was considered the one unifying thing of the Arabs, and everyone brought their gods there. So it was, the shrine was dedicated to Allah, the creator God, but everyone's gods were welcome. So there were, the accounts say there were 360 idols of different deities surrounding the Kaaba, and every year there would be a pilgrimage that was the unifying thing, where people from all over Arabia, the tribes, would come to Mecca to worship their gods, right? And that was the one unifying thing, which led to it becoming a commercial site. Right, to this day, the pilgrimage of Mecca, which continues today without 360 idols, right?
Yes,
but it is literally one of the biggest economic events of the world, because you have millions of people coming, and Islam teaches that not only are you there to worship, you should trade, you should exchange in technology, you should exchange goods, you should learn from each other. So this was an economic central point because of the pilgrimage, and it was an intellectual central point where they exchanged information. It was the one thing you could bring all these guys together here. So suddenly the prophet shows up and says, all these gods are fake except for the one creator God, the God of Abraham, right? And then he says the reason, and he tells them the story, because they don't even know why they do this. This is just an ancient tradition of this city, right? And he tells them, well, this is why. You don't even know, you've forgotten why. This Kaaba was originally built by Abraham and Ishmael. So there we've got the reference to the biblical story of Ishmael being put out into the desert. So the Quranic story is, when that happened, Abraham has two sons. His elder son Ishmael, his younger son is Isaac. Isaac is the father of the Israelite, the Hebrews, that would become Judaism and eventually Christianity. And Ishmael, large in the Bible, is kind of forgotten after that. He's sent off into the desert, right? And he shows up a little bit. His descendants show up a little bit, but they're not that important. They're kind of forgotten. And he's like, no. This was originally the shrine. The reason any of us are even doing any of this is that Abraham, when he sent it, when the Bible says he's put him out in the desert, this is what Abraham did. He brought him here and left him here. And there's a great story in the Bible about the boy was going to die in the desert, and his mother Hagar was just overwhelmed. She didn't know what to do, and she just wept. And then the angel appears, and a spring magically appears out of the ground, a well, so they have water, they can survive. So Mecca has this well, which is one of the central things it calls Zamzam, which is still this incredible well. I mean, that's one of the great unexplained geological miracles, that this well has been, servicing millions of people for thousands of years, and it doesn't run dry. And I've been there. I mean, I've had the well from, you can buy today in the grocery store, at the halal grocery store, you'll get bottles of Zamzam water. It's considered sacred water. It's a well of Ishmael, right? And so this well in the middle of the desert, because I've been there, it's a complete desert. There's nothing there. But this one water source that just, even today, geologists can't exactly figure out where it comes from the water table. It's one of the great mysteries, right? So this water source that appears in the middle of the desert. So it brings, and he says, that's why God built this temple here. Abraham built this temple for the one God. And then over several thousand years, the descendants of Ishmael forgot the one God. Ishmael, was a monotheist like his father. But over the next couple of thousand years, over time, you know, that one god became eclipsed by all the local new gods that were showing up, right? And they started putting up the idols in the Kaaba, right? And so the prophet shows them, says, none of this is what Abraham did. This is all stuff you invented, and we have to return to the religion of Abraham, which is the one God. Return to the religion of Abraham, which is the one God and Abraham built this place with Ishmael, right? And so now that's a threat. So that's an economic and political threat to the elites of Mecca, because they're making all the money from the pilgrimage. That's why they're rich. So if their instinct is, they don't care if the prophet believes in one God. They couldn't care less. But now he's telling them these other gods aren't real. And so pilgrims are showing up, and they're hearing these young people saying, why are you worshiping that rock? It's not real, man. There's no God there. The one God is the only God. And people are like, are you insulting my God? Well, I'm going to go leave Mecca, right? So suddenly they're not trading there. So this is an economic threat. And the sort of oligarchy, the merchant oligarchy, is like, this is going to mess with our money, man. What are you doing? What are you doing, right? And they actually go, I think they mentioned in the movie, they go to the prophet and then they literally offer him like all this wealth and power if he just stops
Yes.
hassling these other gods. Let people,
And that's
do whatever you want.
like
Be quiet.
obviously nothing he'd be interested in.
Yeah, well, and he turns it down, right? And and he turns it down, and that's when it's a problem now. And so you've got these young people denying the existence of these other Arab gods, and so that's offending this Arab religion. And people are getting upset when they come to Mecca and they're being challenged. Then that's a problem. And so they decide now, and especially now it's spreading amongst the young, they have this great moment where one of his adversaries, Abu Sufyan, is one of the oligarchy leaders, says, the young are following him, right? And that's what the Kaaba looks like today. I've been there. And currently the space holds about 3 million people. It's pretty remarkable. And so he says the young are following him, but we are Arabs. We obey our fathers. We don't listen to the young, right? But now the young, it's like, all right, now this is a problem. And we need to get rid of these guys. And for example, one of the figures here is a very important movie. Go back to that slide there. The African gentleman there. Okay. So he's Bilal, who's very important in Islamic history. He was an African slave, and they showed pretty horrific. Because the slaves and the young people were buying into this religion, because it's a religion that's saying, maybe we should increase the life of the poor and help the poor, right? And and free slaves. And this is not attractive to the rich. It's attractive to people like him. So he becomes a Muslim, and then his owner, his slave master, tortures him really horrifically in the desert, right?
Yes, he did. Yes,
it's pretty horrifically shown. And he doesn't run. He just keeps saying one. There's only one God, and that's his response. So Bilal, he ends up, this African gentleman ends up becoming you've heard the beautiful Islamic prayer call.
Yes.
He's the first person that ever did it.
Yes, and they show us this, Kamran. It's remarkable that they even took the time to do that, Kamran, in this film.
Yeah.
Was he also one of the? He was also one of the group that went to Abyssinia that first trip.
I'll be honest. I don't recall if Bilal went, because he was a slave at the time and it took a while to buy him his freedom. I don't recall if he went. But the prophet's own daughter went, right? And
Yes.
And another sort of important is he had actually converted one rich man, Uthman, who ended up becoming the third caliph. But everyone else was, and so he was able to essentially finance everyone getting out of here. So they fled in the middle of the night, and they're like, okay, these guys are going to get there, and what's going to happen now? The economics is they're going to go to Abyssinia. A huge amount of the trade is with Abyssinia, right? And so they're going to show up there, and they're going to be spreading stuff that's going to give us bad PR to our primary trade partner, right?
Yes,
that's a problem, right? And they're going to show up, and so they can't catch these guys, so they dispatch emissaries to the court of the Negus to say, these are criminals. You have to send them back to us. And so they show in the movie that Negus summons them and says, "What's this? You're criminals. I've given you refuge, but you're apparently causing problems at home. What's this about?" And they tell, okay, well, we were this barbaric people. We killed our children. We oppressed the poor. We did all these horrible things, and we oppressed women, all these things. And so but this God sent us a messenger, like he sent to Moses and Jesus in the past, to wake us up from this. And he seems moved by that. And then we can talk. But then the Meccans have a response. Then they go, no, this guy's not this prophet they're talking about ain't your friend, because he's got a different view of Jesus than you do. If you want to talk about that, because it's a brilliant moment. It's in the Islamic history.
I don't know if I have all the details about it. What I do know that happens, Kamran, at least what's on my mind right now about this is that at some point, as things escalate, the prophet and his family are exiled into the desert for
Yes,
3 years.
they're exiled for 3 years. They're basically no one's allowed to trade with them. The idea is to starve them out.
Yes. And what's so interesting about this time period, which also must have been incredibly difficult,
Yes.
they couldn't go back to get things or see people or do anything like
Yeah, they
that.
basically had to live out in the wilderness. Okay,
That's right.
they couldn't go back to their houses. Yeah,
And what I found interesting was that at some point, and I'm not quite sure how this
Mhm.
happened, although I actually wrote everything down on my phone, but I'm trying to go by
yeah.
memory.
It's a big hit. That's just a 3 hour movie, right? It's I would have easily written the 4 to 6 hour version of this, right?
Yes. What's really interesting is that somehow they end up. Is it Baca, or they end up at another city where there's some sort of fight going on,
Yeah,
and
so that's Yathrib. So
yeah,
yeah, so that's we'll get there in a second. I just want to
okay,
finish off what happened with Abyssinia while
yes,
this is happening. So on one, the Muslims are now completely scattered,
yes,
right? You've got the
yes,
prophet put out in the desert,
yes.
and the only reason they're surviving is that people are secretly bringing them food. That's how they're
I'm,
surviving. That's
I'm
it.
sure they are.
Yeah,
I'm
that's it. I
sure
mean,
they
the
would.
people who are
Yeah.
secretly Muslim are quietly going out into the wilderness, giving them food and water, and they survive like that for 3 years, right?
Wow.
So they're out there, and then you've got these people in Abyssinia, and so the Negus wants to give them refuge, and the Meccans say, well, these people they don't follow Jesus, they insult him, they call him a slave. Now in Islam, the phrase Abdullah, slave of God, is the ultimate honor because
Oh,
you're God's servant. I mean, that was Prophet Muhammad's father's name. He's Muhammad, son of Abdullah, right? So Abdullah means the slave of God. So in Islam, from the Islamic paradigm, to be called the slave or the servant of God is the ultimate thing, is the ultimate praise, right? You surrender to the one God. You are his servant. You don't owe, nobody else has power over you, right? But when the Negus hears it, you're calling Jesus a slave, right? So, and then they have this beautiful moment they show in the film where, so what do you say about Jesus? And the priests are unhappy when they hear this, like, get these guys out, right? And then you have this historical moment where one of the leaders of Mecca recited a
yes, yes.
chapter of the Quran
Yes, that's right.
about the
And you're
Virgin
right.
Mary.
I forgot, Cameron,
Yeah,
and I don't know why I would forget this, but apparently Jesus is acknowledged as a prophet as well, from what I understand.
yeah,
Is
yeah. No,
that
he
the
is,
part that you're talking about?
yeah. And so this is so. So what they do is Jesus is a very significant prophet in the Quran. Only Moses is the most important. He shows up all over the time. It shows something like several hundred times. Jesus shows up something 30 plus times. Muhammad is only mentioned, I think, 4 times by name in the Quran. But so Jesus is very significant in the Quran, and so they have the virgin birth story. So he recites it, the virgin birth story, which is very parallel to the biblical version, where Gabriel shows up and tells Mary, "You're going to have this holy son," and all these things, and he praises them, and it's a very beautiful thing. And the theological difference they make clear. Look, we say about Jesus what our prophet tells us, that he was born of the Virgin Mary. He's actually in the Quran, he's called the Spirit of God. He's called the Word of God. Those are actual words, kalimatullah, because God created him with the word be. Just like Adam, just like he just comes into existence by be. So he's the Word of God. He's this because God breathed the Spirit into Mary. He's the Spirit of God, and we see him as God's messenger. And he's the Messiah in Islam. The difference is we do not worship him as a deity. We only worship the one God. All right. And so that's why we give him the highest praise possible of anything that's in creation, which is the slave of God. And so that's a theological difference that exists today. Christians see Jesus as the manifestation of God on earth. They call him the Son of God, and there's a lot of complex theology around that. For Islam, it's very simple. Jesus was God's prophet, his messenger, his voice in this world, and he was a mortal human being, right? With wondrous miracles all around him that were proof of his message. So there's a major theological divide, but it isn't that big. I mean, there's the 2 religions that could consider Jesus the Messiah and the virgin-born, messenger of God, the voice of God, is Christianity, Islam, and they have different theological meanings as to what that means about the divine substance, right? Okay, but it was enough that the king goes, I'm not going to get into theological debates. That's above me. All I know is this sounds good to me. You
Yes, and
guys love
that's
Jesus.
when he
You
made
love
that.
Jesus. You love Mary. You
Yes,
acknowledge Jesus was sent by God. You acknowledge his miracles. That's good enough for me.
and
And he
that's
sends away the emissary, says, they're
yeah.
under my
Mm.
protection.
And that's when he made that comment about the rays of light being the
Yes.
same voice or same message. And I thought it was just, I don't know whether that's the exact words he used, but it almost didn't matter because it was written so beautifully in the
Yeah.
screenplay, Cameron, that it got the point across. And certainly I think it needed to be heard at that point, at a heightened point where these guys were going to be led away in chains if he had not intervened.
Maybe let him change. It probably would have been executed if he would have been died along the way mysteriously, right? And that's what would have happened to them. And this is a very important historical moment, because this was the first refuge Muslims had under a Christian king's mercy. And so the historical relation between the Islamic world and Ethiopia has always been positive. Ethiopia never had a war with the Muslim world that I'm aware of. There was never a jihad to conquer it or anything like that, because the Muslims they were under the protection of the Christian king till modern day, to Haile Selassie, who I think is directly descended from the Negus. Right?
Yes.
And so to modern day, Muslims are prominent, large minority of Ethiopia that have been under the protection of the society, and Christians and Muslims have been brothers together since the beginning.
Yes.
The 1400 years. If one place you knew you could be safe as a Muslim was this Christian kingdom of Ethiopia.
Yeah, and it's absolutely fascinating. As I've told you, I've been there many times, but I didn't know the history of the Islamic history, really. I knew, obviously I could see that there are many Islamic people in Ethiopia, and they are side by side with the Christians, and at one time also with the Jews, who, as we've discussed already, had left in Project Exodus, more or less. But Kamran, I had no idea, let's say just early on, the role that Ethiopia had played in this entire thing. And it's fascinating, Kamran. And I really like it. I really like that this film showed, they could have said that they fled and they got away, but they chose to kind of show this interaction, just really how much interaction was going on.
And how much brotherhood there was between Christians and Muslims. This is, I think, today, when there's people that are polarized against each other in these communities, this is a very important memory. I even wrote a Huffington Post, maybe I'll throw it in the chat. I wrote a Huffington Post article about how the story of Christmas saved Islam. Because literally retelling that story is what kept, because had these people been wiped out, right, that would have been it. Because at that point, once the Meccans see they could get away with this, then they'll be like, nobody's going to stop us. Now that our major ally, the king, thinks they're criminals, we can go after Muhammad in the desert and take him out, right? He won't have any protection. And that was it, right? So this king defending the Muslims saved the entire religion.
Yeah, it's absolutely remarkable story, Kamran. And I was fascinated by this. So of course, as soon as I saw this in the film, I had to stop the film and look up more information and find out, who the king was and all of this stuff. But it certainly is, I think, really just such a lovely story to depict. And we do know that down the line, not in Ethiopia, but in Mecca and with the leaders of Mecca, there's still some friction through all of this.
It gets worse. It gets worse because now they've got a problem with now their major trading partner has a problem with them, right? And so thinks that they're oppressors. That's not a good situation, right? And so that's bad. And now, and it keeps spreading. And now slaves are joining it, and now you got social disruption, right? Women are joining it because women are being given property rights. They're being given all these things that are not, when Islam gives women property rights, that doesn't exist outside of Islam at the time. It is shocking for people to us today and say Christianity did not permit women to own property. It didn't permit them to testify in court. That's not permitted in the Bible, because women were considered to be, not as wise, and they couldn't manage their property, and they couldn't be trusted to give honest testimony. So those things change in the West in the late 19th century. So women's property rights is 100 years old in America and in Britain, whereas women, Prophet Muhammad, women, his wife has money, right? And he establishes that as the rule that women can have their own property separate from men, that no man can take. And that gave women a power that did not exist anywhere else on the planet, because they had property rights. And we talk about in Mehmed, we talked about in the Ottoman show how even the women of the harem were rich and they owned large swaths of land, which European women, queens, couldn't imagine that.
And, it is interesting as you and I are talking about this, and I do want to mention this a lot about this, how there seems to be at some point then a manhunt for the prophet, it goes into the situation where it's not anything that they necessarily want to allow him to get away. They feel like they have to.
It gets bad. Finally, they're like, we got to get out of here.
Yes.
Because what happens is his wife dies. So his, Khadija, his wife, who's the first Muslim, she dies.
And then his uncle who's
protecting him
all this time as much as he could. And he realized that, he could no longer be there safely. Every excuse that they had to attack him now has been,
all the protections are gone. And so they actually organized an assassination attempt.
Yes.
And the way they do it is in order to prevent there from being any sort of, because this is the only rule of Arabia is the law of retaliation. If someone kills someone in my family, I get to kill somebody in your family. Not even I can kill an innocent person in your family, but that's got an eye for an eye, right? And so the idea was, so that was the only thing, that if you try to kill Muhammad, someone in his clan is going to have to kill one of your guys, and that's a problem, right? And so they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to send a representative of every clan,
Yes.
break into his house in the middle of the night, and all of us are going to stab him to death. So
Oh
all
my
20
God.
of us. And,
Yes,
and
and
then
that's
there's who you're gonna be. There are not enough people to take out all all of our clans, and that's it. And that will end it, right? And then the movie shows they arrive in this, and they throw open the bed covers, and it's actually not the prophet. He's already escaped. His son-in-law Ali has actually volunteered to mislead them, so he's hiding under the blankets. And Ali could have been killed, because they could have just stabbed him in the blanket. They didn't know, but they took the time to take off the blanket to stab him, and they saw it's not the guy. Crap. He's out. We gotta go find him.
There's even a scene, Cameron, in the film, and I think it's actually in here, although I don't remember exactly where you see this kind of cobwebs, and what the cobwebs are the prophet.
Oh, that's very significant. Yes, the cobweb, the spider scene. It's so what happens is the show, it's really beautifully shown in this movie. So yeah, so the prophet and his best friend Abu Bakr, right? The man who would later say Muhammad is dead. He's the one that stabilized the Muslims after that crisis. He's like, Muhammad is dead. If you worship him, it's too bad. It's done, right? God is around forever. So he and Abu Bakr, his best friend, are hiding in this cave, and the assassins are, they're like Native American trackers. They track through the desert and they figure out where they went, and they find this cave. And Abu Bakr's like, we're dead. That's it. And it's actually referenced in the Quran. The Quran actually talks about this incident where the prophet then said, just trust God. God is with us. If it's not two of us in this cave, it's three of us. There's you, me, and there's God. We're going to be okay. And what happens is the assassins show up, and suddenly a spider has created this lengthy cobweb in front of the door over that, in the course of a few hours. And the cobweb looks like it's been there for years. And so like, well, obviously he didn't go through there, right? And so that's why that's considered one of the great mystical, magical moments, miraculous moments of Islam, is that, they should have just walked in and killed them. But the spider web convinced them, he couldn't have gone in there. It's obviously covered.
I love it, Cameron. And there are quite a few questions in the chat. Earlier on,
Yes.
there was one person who wanted to know, it's Adnan Kabir. Hi,
Yes.
Adnan. Do you think that they will ever make another film like this again? I think they will, Cameron. What do you think?
I think I might. They've been trying to remake, Hollywood has no interest in making this film, none whatsoever. This was Mustafa Akkad, who was a Muslim himself, right? Who pushed this forward in the 70s, which is, he got independent financing. He just went all over the Middle East, and it was a crazy idea, and he got financing from people, and he pulled it off. No one's been able to do it since this kind of epic. Like I said, there have been Arabic language and Iranian and Urdu language, things like this, but never in English again. So I published a novel about telling this story from the point of view of the prophet's wife Aisha, right? So this entire story I've told from another person's point of view, right? And so I already have a screenplay. I have a screenplay ready to go based on that novel, right? And it's all about, I've been approached by various rich Middle Easterners over time. They want to, me to do it, but each time the project has fallen apart because their intentions are not good. Let's just say there's a lot of rich oil sheiks who think I can finally enter Hollywood and bang some Hollywood actresses and hang out with Tom Cruise, and this is my angle into it. I literally had one rich person tell me, I asked him why he's a rich person in Qatar, flew me out to Qatar, and they were claiming they're going to make this epic movie on the prophet, and they were going to give me $1 billion thing to write it, and $1 billion budget for the epic film, right? And that was their claim. And these are oil people, so they might have been able to have that kind of money. But I got a very bad vibe from them, that there's something's wrong here, even though I knew they had the money. And I asked them, I said, why? I had what you said. I said, I wrote this book on Aisha, the prophet's wife. I've been thinking about it since I was a little boy. And 40 years later, I wrote this book. Have you been thinking about doing this movie about the prophet? Like I said, all these years since you saw the message or whatever, what motivates you? And it's amazing how the divine caused this gentleman's tongue to open. He said something that I cannot imagine any Muslim would ever say if he had thought about it. His tongue opened and he said, oh, we don't care about the prophet at all. We're just trying to make money on this project.
Oh, dear.
And this is in the Middle East, in the Islamic world. It comes right out of his mouth. And I was so shocked. And I said, and I responded to them. I said, I think there's a misunderstanding here. You think you're interviewing me for this job to write this movie for you? God's interviewing you for this job. And I think you just failed the interview. I said that to them. They could not believe, because these rich people, they don't expect everyone kisses their butt to get the money. And they couldn't believe I said that to them. and they were stunned, they were shook, and that movie never got made. And so I intend, God willing, to make it one day. Someone else pulls it off before me, good for them. I have my own version of this, and I'm just trying to get to a place in the industry where I can do what George Lucas did, which is self-finance. Just make it myself, because I don't trust the industry to do it. Mustafa Khan didn't get the money from Hollywood. It wasn't studio production. He got it from the Middle East, and he pulled it off. So it's never been done since. And Hollywood, I don't think, has any desire to tell this story.
Well, I have a desire to see the story retold many times. I think there's a lot more to the story we haven't even seen, Kamran. And this next question here says, have you seen the Omar Ibn al-Khattab series, miniseries? It's only in Arabic with subtitles, and it is super long, like 30 parts, but it is a great series. I haven't seen this. Have you, Kamran?
Yeah, so Omar Ibn al-Khattab was the second caliph. I don't believe he shows up in this movie. They were very cautious about not just the Prophet Muhammad, but sort of the very central figures. You don't see his wife Khadija. You don't see Ali. You actually only see Ali's sword, right? There's in a battle, you see his sword, which is a famous double-bladed sword. Remember when we were watching the Ottoman series, right?
Yes.
We were watching that, and there was some of the flags had a sword that sort of split in half or in two, right? You might have seen that, this unusual image. That's Ali's sword. It was a famous sword that had double blades, right? And so that's the sword of Ali, which sort of represents justice and triumph in the Islamic world, right? And so we only see a sword. And so they were very cautious about the most holy figures, like the caliphs, Ali, and these people that are very central to Islam. They didn't want to show them, just in case someone said that, you've disrespected this holy figure. So other figures like his adopted son Zayd sort of save that role. And what's interesting is Zayd. It's interesting because Zayd, you saw his adopted son Zayd. He was a slave, and the Prophet freed him and adopted him as his own son, right? Which was considered bizarre in that world. This was before he even got his message, as when he was still sort of pre-prophethood. He had freed Zayd as a teenage boy and adopted him because he didn't have any sons. All of his sons died in childbirth, right? And he had daughters. And so he adopted him as his son. And so Zayd is actually very significant because none of the Prophet's contemporaries are mentioned in the Quran by name. Not even Abu Bakr, the man in the cave. Literally, the Quran calls him the second in the cave. They're all mentioned by titles, right? They're all given titles by Muslims see it as God giving them titles, which is an honorific. The only one mentioned by name in the Quran is Zayd. And so that shows, how important he was in Islam. The only person that the Prophet knew who's mentioned by name in the Quran is Zayd, right? But he's the one that sort of becomes the voice for the whole thing, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other figure is, and we'll get to the question. The other figure is Anthony Quinn, who plays the Prophet's uncle, Hamza, who is a great warrior who ended up, embracing Islam after seeing his nephew being abused and mistreated, and it upset his sense of dignity. And he wasn't going to be Muslim, but when he saw his nephew was not bothering anybody and just sort of preaching compassion and oneness of God, and they're kicking him and they're abusing him, that filled him with such righteous anger that he embraced Islam there and became the Prophet's physical defender, right? And so, but one of the other major figures that's not shown in this film out of sort of sensitivities is the second caliph, Omar, who is very significant. He's the one that essentially solidified the Islamic empire. Right, he's after the Prophet dies, his best friend Abu Bakr takes over as the first caliph, and there's an immediate civil war where a lot of these Arab tribes said, "Okay, Prophet's done. I'm out. He's not here anymore. I'm out." Right, and literally, that's what the Quran said. When he dies, will you turn your back? And that's exactly what happens. So all these Prophet tribes, he's gone. I'm done. I'm going back to the old ways. Right, and so then literally they're going back to the old ways, and they basically rebel against the government that the Prophet has created, because he creates by the end of the movie and by the end of his life, he had actually turned this disorganized society into a state with a leadership, with a treasury, with courts of justice, with something to help the poor, right? All that stuff. And they're like, no, we're out. And so they start rebelling. They start physically rebelling, and Abu Bakr crushes the rebellion and ends it, right? And then he passes away. And shortly after he passes away, Omar becomes the next caliph, and he essentially takes on the Byzantine Empire, which is hinted to in this movie. The Byzantine, so we had this good relations with the Abyssinian Christians, right?
Yes.
But the Byzantine Empire, which is the imperial power of the entire Middle East, suddenly sees something happening in Arabia that makes no sense. They're like, these desert tribes are organizing into a state? What's happening here? And then, like, they started sending in, like, their own military, say, we're gonna have to quash this because we don't want a new state on our border that never existed before, right? And so the Prophet sent emissaries, ambassadors, which is shown in the movie. He sent ambassadors to the Byzantine emperor, right? And the Byzantine emperor had the ambassadors killed because he says, what is this crap? Prophet in the desert, whatever, get killed. And so that began, the Muslims like, you're going to kill our ambassadors. So with the Ottomans, you kill our ambassadors is one response, right? And so the Muslims then went to war against the Byzantines for killing the ambassador, and
Okay.
Omar, the caliph who led that war, and he won. Literally, they conquered the entire Middle East in a period of a few years. Like 632, the prophet is dead. Within 4 years, they've conquered Jerusalem, and they've taken over the entire. Byzantines just collapse. This one mistake they did of killing the prophet's ambassadors leads to the literal collapse of the empire. So all they have left is like Constantinople within just a few years, right? So the gentleman who asked the question, there was a miniseries, an epic miniseries about Omar, this caliph, that was done in Arabic. I have not seen it. I don't speak Arabic. I'm sure it's available
With subtitles or something. Yeah.
Sure, I'm sure. I have not seen it, but it was another breakthrough thing because people were afraid of showing Omar, who's so significant in the Islam, right? They were afraid to show one of the early caliphs, right? But they did it, and the world didn't end. The world didn't end. God did not strike them down. So that is now that taboo has been broken
Yes.
artistically, and it will continue.
Now, Cameron, I also noticed that at some point, and I may not have it in the correct order, but
Yes.
at some point they do show the first pilgrimage, or what they are describing as one of the first pilgrimages from the prophet's point of view.
Yes.
And I loved that, Cameron. I thought that was incredible. I knew that they were going to do this, but to show it from the prophet's point of view, it was just amazing, Cameron. You felt like you were going along with that first.
Yeah, because it's such an epic moment. He's been banned from Mecca, right? So the
Yes.
background, he's been banned from Mecca, and he's saying this pilgrimage isn't the problem. It's these false gods you've created around the God of Abraham. Abraham built this place. He instituted the pilgrimage. The Quran says there's a story in the Quran where Abraham is commanded in the desert, where he's out there with the Ishmael. He's out in the desert with his son, and God commands him, call to mankind to come here. And he says, there's nobody here. There's nobody here except me and my son, and my wife Hagar, right? There's nobody here. And then Gabriel says, no, they will hear it, right? Give out the call. And so Abraham goes to a hill, just sort of predecessor to the Islamic prayer call, which you see Bilal does, right? He calls out to mankind, come. And so when you go to pilgrimage, you actually, when you arrive, when I first landed, for the pilgrimage in Mecca and Medina, immediately people start, they have a simple prayer where you just respond to Abraham. There's Labaik Allahumma Labaik, which means I answer your call, God. That's it. That's the thing. It's like you're answering Abraham's call. So you constantly recite this prayer as you're on the pilgrimage, is I'm answering this call Abraham made. And so the prophet is saying, I don't have a problem with the pilgrimage. It's what you've done to it, right? That has nothing to do with Abraham. I want all this other stuff out. And he's been banned from Mecca. And not only has he been banned from Mecca, he finds, as you said, he goes to this northern oasis. That's where he escapes from the assassins. He goes to northern oasis, Yathrib, where they have these warring tribes. And they finally decide, well, we need an arbiter.
Yes.
There's no government. There's no government, right? So we need an arbiter. We all agreed. We've been killing each other for 100 years. It's literally a Hatfield McCoy's feud that's been going on for 100 years, and they keep killing each other. And so it's like they finally come to agreement. If you can find an independent third party who will serve as the judge of our disputes,
yes, and
so they're like, this guy, he's the El Amin, he's the respected. Yeah, he's got this other religion, and so they bring him in because he's not from the local area, and everyone, at least whether they believe his religion or not, they at least believe he's trustworthy.
But there is a caveat, Cameron, which is fine, and that the prophet agrees to be the mediator in this dispute with the condition that people will accept the monotheistic religion. And
they're being invited to it because already many of them had kind of already on the converted on the side, right? It's actually people from Medina, from what's called Medina. Literally, Yathrib was the name of the town. It's renamed Medina, which means the city of the prophet, right? Medina. It's like the city par excellence, right? So the reason he's come there is that emissaries from Medina, who are his followers, now say, we've convinced these people that you can be their arbiter. So he comes. They're not, Islam does not permit forced conversion, right? And so they weren't forced to convert. By then, he already has a following there. And he shows up as the arbiter, and then that following starts spreading as for the first time, people start seeing any kind of justice. There's no court system. It's hard for us to imagine here. There is no court system in this world. Justice is meted out by you killing your enemy or paying them off, or somebody paying you off to get out. That's it. So suddenly you have this idea of an arbiter doesn't exist for them. So he arrives, and he starts settling their disputes. They've had nobody settling their disputes ever. And people are like, okay, I can accept that. Okay, that judgment's fine. And they're like, oh wow, this is new, and that suddenly makes this religion attractive. The
Yeah.
idea of justice that doesn't exist for these desert Arabs.
Fairness,
Fairness, and they start
equality.
adopting it en masse. They
We are
start
all
adopting,
the same under the eyes of God.
and there's rules. There's rules. You all know what the rules are, so you know if you broke them, right? And so and so then this suddenly, very quickly, the Oasis converts because they're like, this is great, and that ends the fight between the tribes.
Yes.
This 100-year-old feud ends because they are now brothers in this new religion, right? And now this is a problem for the Meccans because now he's got his own community, which is a rival economic source because it's a beautiful oasis, right? And so now he's got his own community that's economically independent of Mecca up there. So what they start doing is they're like, we've got to destroy this. These Muslims now have a place, and he's becoming like a leader. He's becoming an arbiter. I mean, this guy might become like a ruler. We got to stop this. So what they start doing is they basically, a bunch of Muslims were still left behind in Mecca. And so essentially they ransack those people, steal all their goods and sell them. Basically, the idea is to impoverish the Muslims, right? Cut off the economic support they can give to the Medina contingent.
Yes.
And so now the Prophet is facing with, so these caravans are taking their stolen goods, right?
Yes.
And so then they have to confront these caravans that have stolen, the wealth of the people, right? And so that leads to the first military conflict between Muslims, because again, from the Muslim point of view, we're not raiding these people. These stole our money, and they're going off to, on the caravan to profit from it. So we're going to take our stuff back. And then the Meccans were hoping for this, right? Because this is it, right? This is the moment, right? So now, all right, he's going to come for his stuff, right? He's going to come for his stuff. Well, he got a bunch of soldiers now. What's he going to do about that, right? And he doesn't want to fight. And that's so pivotal in the movie. They show that. He does not want to fight. That's historical. Muslim, again, people who are critics of Islam, you're a warlike religion. And this is very much in the Islamic sources. The Prophet Muhammad did not want to go to military. He had never fought. He wasn't a warrior. He said he was a gentle guy. He didn't like fighting. And they're all like, look, these guys have hundreds of soldiers. They actually had an army of 1,000 people protecting this caravan, right? And they're coming. And if you don't respond to them stealing your stuff, and the soldiers that are coming onto this, your border now, they're going to raid this thing and kill all of you. And you have this great moment where his uncle convinces him, you have to fight because it's self-defense or we all die.
Yes.
And the Prophet's like, I don't want to do that. And finally, the command from the Quran comes, says, all right, you may fight against this injustice, but do not go outside the bounds of the law. God establishes the rules of war. So this is fascinating because Islam establishes rules of war which don't exist in that time.
Those rules are things like do not kill women and children.
Do not kill priests.
You're not going to kill the elderly.
Yes.
Do not kill anybody who is not attacking you. If they're not in the fight, don't kill that person.
Yeah, and don't poison wells, don't burn down trees. They show that. Bilal is sent to announce this.
Don't destroy stuff that doesn't belong to you.
Don't do environmental damage. And these are because this is like, again, now he's establishing rules. This is something people don't understand. Islamic law, where does it come from? It comes from a world that had no rules. Jesus did not live in a world like this. This is very hard for Christians to understand. Like, well, Jesus never fought anybody. Jesus didn't need to. He lived in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
There's soldiers everywhere. There's guards, there's policemen in the streets, there's courts of law. Jesus actually says in the Gospels, a woman comes to him with a dispute and he says, I'm not going to resolve this. There's a court. He says, go resolve it. This problem, go to the court. It's not my problem. I'm here to teach you something. They don't even have that. They don't even have that, right? So now it's like, well, what do you do? We're gonna have to fight. What are the rules of that? And this is fascinating because nobody has rules of war at this time. It's a free-for-all. The Byzantines, they come, they defeat you, they kill the entire village. That's what you get, right? And the idea of having these rules is, again, women owning property. That's a new rule. Where's this coming from? Having rules of war of who you cannot kill and what your limits are. That's new. So again, this is quite shocking to the world. It's shocking to the Christian world. And this is one of the reasons when Islam confronted the Byzantine Empire later in the 8 days of Omar, that it was actually the reason the Byzantines were defeated was their own people rose up. This is one of the most fascinating historical things. It happened in Egypt and it happened in Syria, Palestine. The local populace who were Christians, and in Palestine, there were some Jews who had been expelled from Jerusalem. They rose up and joined the Muslim armies and flooded open the doors because they said, these guys have rules of war. They have all these rules of if they're gonna win over us, that these are how we're gonna be governed. And the Byzantines were like, if you don't follow this exact theology of the Byzantine church, you're a false Christian and heretic. And they were crushing other Christians. So Christians rose up. And this is how the Muslims conquered the Middle East. This is something, because it's not a historical probable moment. They were outnumbered 10-1 throughout the whole process, but the populace was on their side because they were establishing new rules that had never been heard of certainly in the Middle East at that time. And this is something that a lot of critics of Islam have difficulty, because they're like, well, this is barbaric about Islam. It's like, you want to talk about barbarism? You want to go back to Byzantine world 7th century? You'd be begging for Islam. You'd be begging for it. And that's what happened.
Cameron, I also want to ask you about another part in the story, and I think it might have happened just before the part that we're talking about, but I could be wrong. Maybe it's after. And it has to do when the prophet enters, I believe it's Medina. It may not be Medina. So when the prophet enters Medina on a camel, and I guess the prophet is going to be living here from now on.
Yeah, this is going to be his home. Yes.
Yes. And he had to figure out where he had to.
Because everyone's saying, come stay with me. And that would be my honor if you stay in my house, then and so this is how he resolved it, or at least as a Muslim thing, this is how God told him to resolve it. So he says, I'm not going to choose where I go. God will choose it. So he sits on his camel. Again, the camera's point of view is the camera, cinematographer's on the camel, right? So you see it from that point of view, right? And the camel and his camel, and he just didn't do anything. And he let the camel walk wherever he wanted to walk. And the camel walked, and then it knelt down at a particular open space. And he said, this is where God wants us. And then he immediately starts building the first mosque of Medina, which he starts building with his own hands, right? He's not out there saying, all right, workers, do what you need for me, right? He's literally out there like, give me stones. And he's the one that lays the foundation. And he physically builds it with his own hands along with everyone else. And that immediately was, again, something they had not heard of, because he's like, there's no social status. I'm not going to go live in your house or this chieftain's house or that. God's going to choose it. And then you're all going to build this place together with me.
And it is kind of interesting, Kamran, because we hear a lot of stories like this where they sound mythical, but this is incredibly practical. And I had no idea I do like a story like that, where that's where the first mosque would be, or something, that very first building. It's just absolutely wonderful.
Well, and again, most historians don't deny. I mean, historians will say, well, these miracles about Muhammad, I don't believe that. That's fine. But no historian denies those kinds of events, because it fits. Those are how Muslims were con, and it fits because it fit the kind of culture they would later create. This kind of egalitarian society was not something that anyone had envisioned before. And Islamic history shows, with all of its ups and downs, there are moments of oppression where leaders oppress people, but there was definitely an egalitarian movement that caused the Christians of the Middle East to rise up and join it, right? And so that historians don't deny, which was an unusual moment. And so these stories that establish the egalitarianism of Islam are probable from historians' point of view, because they fit what we now documented happened later.
Absolutely, Kamran. And, it is absolutely fascinating. At some point, there is some kind of a truce. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like there's some sort of...
There's a truce with Mecca because you're losing. Because now this is spreading, right? This is spreading everywhere. Because now
there's do something here, or else there won't be a Mecca left, or,
Yeah, exactly. They're waiting, and other tribes are like joining up. And so they're banning Muslims from the pilgrimage. So now it's a problem, because now it's spreading throughout Arabia. And so now these people are not allowed to come to pilgrimage, where their money's getting affected, right? The whole thing, the pilgrimage is going to bring all these people. Well, you just banned, 10%, now 20%, now 30%, now 40% of the peninsula, you're banning them. So what do you do, right? And so they eventually decide, okay, Meccans decide, we'll make a truce. And this thing you talk about, they allow the prophet to have his first ever pilgrimage that he was allowed to go on.
Yes.
And it was done under the terms of this truce, is the Meccans would evacuate the city, because they were afraid that the Muslims would show up and kill them.
Yes.
So they evacuate the city, but don't worry, you don't have to, but they show up, and the Muslims don't destroy the idols. They said, our agreement with them is they'll have their religion. We're going to go and perform the rites of Abraham and ignore the idols. And they do that, and they leave. And so many people come, the Meccans are like, wait a minute, pilgrimage ain't going to go away if this thing wins out. It's actually going to do pretty well, right? So that starts softening up their materialism. And then this event happens, because the prophet has made a 10-year truce with them, that, we're not going to fight you. You're not going to fight us. And the rule, we'll be able to go to the pilgrimage. We'll leave you alone. You leave us alone. And it was a pretty one-sided truce. It was, if a Muslim decides to leave or flees, let's say a Muslim gets in trouble, he breaks the law in Medina, and not wanting to face the judgment, he rushes to Mecca. You can hold on to him. You can keep him. You don't have to give him back to us. But if a Meccan flees, even a Muslim flees Mecca to come to Medina, we will send him back to you. So it's a very one-sided deal, right? And the prophet's followers were very upset by that. They're like, what is this? We're giving them everything, right? He's like, and literally this is the moment, one of the most important chapters of the Quran is revealed, because when this treaty was made, the Prophet's followers were very upset. They're like, why, we have all the leverage, why are we making it one-sided to their benefit? They're losing this, man. And so then this chapter of the Quran is revealed that's called the victory, Fatah. We lead the victory, and it says this, and it has God saying, this is your victory. This truce is your victory. You're going to win from this. And the Muslims are like, how are we going to win? We've just abdicated everything. It's like, no, this is your victory. The war is not your victory. It's this peace treaty that's going to be your victory. Again, for the perception of Islam as a warlike religion, the Quran says this peace treaty is your victory. And an entire chapter of the Quran is revealed explaining that this, just trust this, what's going to happen now.
And so, Kamran, obviously, as we've said, that the Prophet was illiterate, and that it was his followers and other believers in the Islamic tradition who wrote good portions of this. Over how many years was it written approximately, so we can get it?
The Quran itself, So the Quran itself is revealed piecemeal, like I said, verse for verse. Often it's just one line. Sometimes it's hundreds of lines, sometimes an entire chapter, right? It happened instantly. The Prophet will go into trance for 2 hours and just these words are spewing out of his mouth. And whenever this happening, the people around him who were literate were writing it down immediately. And what was happening, because it was not a literate culture, it was a memorization culture. And so the Prophet was surrounded by people who would memorize it.
And the oral tradition was very important.
Oral tradition, because again, it's not a literate culture. There is some literacy, and so every verse of the Quran was written down by somebody, right? But it was memorized immediately. And so to this day, there is a memorization tradition that's very respected in Islam. It's very prestigious. You're called a hafiz if you know the Quran by heart. And my aunt knew the Quran by heart. It's not a small, it's a substantial portion of the Muslim population today knows the Quran by heart, a very large portion of it. And that's unusual for Christians. Like most Christians could not recite Genesis word for word, right? Yeah, they couldn't do it. They couldn't recite. They could quote Jesus in a couple lines. They couldn't recite the Gospel of John from memory, right? It's unusual. But this was the living tradition. And so over 23 years, the bits and pieces of the Quran come, and they don't appear in a linear fashion, because from a Muslim point of view, it's God speaking. God is not linear, right? And so, a chapter of the Quran could start off with talking about Abraham, and then jump to the day of judgment in the future, then jump back to Adam, then jump to a problem the Prophet is facing in his current lifetime, jump to a legislation issue, then jump over to something else, because God doesn't think in a linear fashion like we do, right? And so it's all pointed together. There's only one chapter in the Quran that's a linear story intentionally, and it's called the best of stories, the story of Joseph, the patriarch Joseph, of the son of Jacob. And that's the only story in the Quran that's told in a linear thing. It's a very powerfully told story. It's very similar, but not exactly the same as the biblical story. It has a different focus. So over bits and pieces, it's put together. And one of the other traditions that's a living tradition today is that in the month of Ramadan, which is coming up in a few weeks, Muslims are encouraged, it's not required, but encouraged to go to the mosque every night, where the Quran, so it's 30 nights of Ramadan. So after you fast, you break your fast during the Ramadan, at night you go to the prayer. It's called the Tarawih prayer, where the Imam, who is a Hafiz, who's a memorizer, then recites 1/30 of the Quran every night. So every single year, the entire Quran is recited in the community to make sure that no one forgets a verse of it. There's no errors, there's no continuity, there's no discrepancy, right? And that is a living tradition today of the Islam entire world. So even people who are not Muslims, scholars who think, this is a great thing that Muhammad invented, great, right? They don't actually deny that the Quran is accurately preserved because of this incredible memorization process. And there's no centralized church to try to say, well, this book has to be destroyed, this book is not in the Quran. It's literally the community saying, checking itself through memorization. And
there are a lot of historical groups that value oral tradition. Oral tradition is real. It's not something that's imagined. It's a big deal and can go back thousands of years. So it's not something that just came about. It's something that's been around for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah, and one of the things is, again, this is just a personal spiritual thing. There's a verse in the Quran that says, God says, I read as God saying, we have revealed the Quran and we have made it easy to memorize. It's an actual verse in the Quran. And so I don't speak Arabic, but I'm not memorizing the entire Quran, but there's entire long chapters of the Quran that I have my memory, and it wasn't even intentional. You just read the Quran, and it just gets into your head in the rhythm, and you discover I can recite the entire chapter from heart. And it's a weird thing. Like you don't generally open up Exodus, read it a couple of times, and think, I can recite, Exodus from heart, but
No.
the entire chapters of the Quran where I've just read them a few times in Arabic, and then suddenly I know it, and it's a very strange phenomenon, right? And so so that's what happened. So the Quran is put together, in the Prophet's lifetime, but so the pilgrimage is actually very important because the last verse of the Quran will be revealed in the moment we're going to get to. So this first pilgrimage that you talked about, they let him in, everything goes okay, like okay, fine, we got a truce now, and then the movie shows that the Meccans, one of their allies decided, they had some beef with some other tribe that was under Muslim protection, and they decided, this truce was whatever. They attacked the Muslim tribe and killed them. And this is the Meccan tribe, right? And so this wasn't something the Meccan leaders wanted, but they didn't control their allies. The allies basically thought they had Mecca, not understanding that the world had changed. They thought they had Mecca's protection, and so they broke the treaty and attacked.
Oh, that's why there was that sneak, kind of like a sneak attack.
There's a sneak attack. You saw those people sitting there, and these raiders come in and kill these people, right?
Yes.
And so that violates the truce. And so the Prophet said, all right, the truce is violated. If the truce is violated, then we're done. And so he then led an army of 10,000 Muslims to Mecca. And the Meccans realized, said, well, you broke the truce. You killed our people. We didn't kill your people. You killed us, right? So this is it. And by now, almost the entire peninsula has embraced Islam. So Mecca is like this little island now, of this trapped island trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make any sense. And
what are we going to do?
20 years. 20 years ago, Muhammad is this guy they're trying to kill who's a nobody, right?
Yeah.
20 years later, he's united the entire peninsula, created a government and a state and a judicial system and an army in 20 years. I mean, it's a remarkable achievement. And they didn't know what was happening. It was all happening in their lifetimes. They're like, this doesn't make any sense. How are we watching every day something change radically? So suddenly this army shows up, and they have this great moment they show where the leader of Mecca, Abu Sufyan, goes out to meet with the Prophet and say, what are you going to do now? You're going to kill us? Because at this point, they don't have an army to face this, right? All the tribes of Arabia have sent armies now to join this, right? So they're completely isolated from their own people. And so that's when you have this great moment where, where you have Bilal, the slave master, is like, there's no compulsion of religion. We're not going to kill you, right? But, and then the Prophet gives them the surrender terms. It's very simple. You broke the treaty. You're now going to surrender Mecca, and there will be no fighting. We're not, because these people, and one of the things we showed, his uncle Hamza, was killed in one of the battles, and really horrifically, and was cannibalized. That's the kind of thing, again, that the pre-Islamic Arabs had these ugly traditions. And so his uncle Hamza was killed, played by Anthony Quinn, was killed in one of the battles, and then Abu Sufyan's wife, played brilliantly by Irene Papas, who's
she was wonderful in that.
She went and because he had killed her father in the previous battle, so she wanted revenge for that, and so she went and she cannibalized him on the battlefield. She ripped out his liver.
I noticed that I guess it's mutilated.
Yeah, she mutilated his body on the battlefield, took out his liver, and ate it in front of everyone, right? And so it's pretty intense stuff, right? And it's also, because this is a tragic thing. Her brother is in the Muslim army. Her brother's converted to Islam. And her brother, when the father came out to fight them, the brother stood up and said, I'm going to fight my father for you. And the Prophet said, no, sit down. You're not gonna kill your father, right? And then and then his uncle confronted him, and his uncle won the battle. It was a one-on-one swordsmanship fight, right? And his uncle won. And then she cannibalized him. So everyone thought, this guy, we not only we killed your family members, we cannibalized them, we've been crushing your people for 20 years, we've done all these horrific things. So they're expecting a massacre. They're expecting a full massacre because they can't fight back. The Prophet surrounded the city. It's over, right? So he can completely take justice on any of them. And Abu Sufyan's like, all right, I'm ready. You want to kill me? I'm here, right? And then to their shock, the Prophet gives him a complete amnesty.
He gives them
utter shock to them.
And he says, he almost asks them to spread the message. He wants them to join them.
Exactly.
And he says, if there's those of you, or if there's anyone here who knows how to read and write, we need your help. He actually puts them to work right away, Kamran.
And puts them to work in levels of prestige. So his son, which I don't think they showed that in this movie, his son became the Prophet's personal scribe. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the $5 super chat.
Oh, we got our friend Abu Nasr.
Yes. Thank you so much. I so appreciate that. It's so kind of you. Abu Nas says the message is a masterpiece for me. I'm trying to find the movie on Blu-ray so I can have it in my library. My bro Cameron is breaking it down. Well, Abu Nas, thank you so much for your generous super chat and for stopping by. It's so appreciated. We are glad that you are enjoying the program tonight. And Cameron, yes, Cameron, 1 minute they have swords in their hand.
Yeah.
And the next minute they're probably reading to someone.
Well, that's
Cameron,
exactly it. And this is, again, from just a historical perspective, setting aside any religious claims, the Prophet Muhammad is an absolute visionary statesman, because he does the one thing nobody expects. He takes the Meccan elite and incorporates them into the new system, because at this point the old religion is dead. So you have this moment where they finally walk in and they destroy all the idols. You have this great scene where you don't see the prophet, you see his staff, and he shatters the idol of Hubal, which is the king god of Mecca, right? It's a Syrian god that represented the moon. You've got some people, let's just say, who are anti-Muslim critics who claim that Islam worships a moon god, right? That Allah is the moon god. That's not correct. Hubal, which is a derivative of Baal from the Canaanites, Hubal was the moon god, and he was the god of Mecca, and the prophet destroys that idol, right? And so that is an incorrect statement that's unfortunately found a lot of support in evangelical Christian communities who critique Islam. I was like, that's actually just not true. Hubal was the moon god, and he was destroyed. But the prophet destroys all the idols, but spares all the people, and then incorporates the entire Meccan leadership, because he understands something. They can read and write. They have economics. They're still wealthy, even if they're trapped in the city now, which is under siege, right? And they still have all these allegiances with all these governments, because they were the de facto rulers of the society. So it's the human side might be like, punish them, for all these terrible things they did to my own family, right? They killed my loved ones. And he's like, no Islam needs them. Islam needs them. And after he dies, after the first initial caliphs that were elected by the Muslims, then a dynasty began, and it's Abu Sufyan's son begins the Umayyad dynasty, which is the first sort of Islamic empire. So this guy, who is the prophet's number one enemy, his son is the leader of the empire. It's quite remarkable.
It is remarkable. I didn't know that. And I almost want to restart the show, because there were some things that we talked about here. Of course, is his son and the uncle who are concerned about him. Yeah. And these are some of the, I guess, the leaders or
so that's the actors playing his adopted son Zayd, and that's his uncle, who protected him, Abu Talib, who died, and when he died, they had no protection. Yeah. So and this is Hind and Abu Sufyan, who were essentially the king and queen of Mecca. And there's this really wonderful, wonderful emotional moment, because these are great actors, and they're playing the villains of the piece, right? Where at the very end, when they're looking out, and the prophet, he understood, again, just like Mehmed would understand later, that the best warfare is just psychological. You don't need to fight anybody. So when he had the 10,000 people show up at night, he had each person build a personal bonfire. Right? Not just one bonfire for 50 people. He had every individual build a personal. So you had 10,000 bonfires on the horizon that lit up the sky like the sun, right? So the army looked like there was 100,000 people, right? Just looking at that. They had never seen anything like it, right? So you had this entire, and then they know they're defeated. They know it's over, and they think they're about to be killed, right? And so they have this moment where Hind, who's been this horrific, she cannibalized his uncle. She cannibalized him. She looks to him and goes, how could we have been so wrong? He says, if my gods were real, they would have helped us. They're not real. Because the interesting thing about Abu Sufyan is he actually, unlike most Meccans, he believed this religion. Most Meccans, like, whatever, people believe this cult, whatever, make money on it, right? He actually believed in these gods. He was loyal to the gods of his fathers. And like, where are they? They're not here. They abandoned. These gods were never real. And then she says, how could we have been so wrong? And this is the humbling of the elite. I was so sure I was right, but here I am, I'm defeated. How could I have been wrong? It's one of the most powerful moments of the movie, where you have the ego shattered. How could I have been this wrong?
Yeah, it is just absolutely fascinating, Cameron, the change of heart that they have, and it's genuine change of heart. It's not. Yeah,
they become leaders in the Muslim world. Abu Sufyan's son becomes the Umayyad emperor. Hind ends up using her great intense abilities on battlefields for PR. So she ends up becoming one of the big, she goes in the future battles, the Muslims, riling them up with she was a singer and would she would rile them up with incredible war songs, right? To get them to fight the Byzantines. So this woman ends up becoming a major part of future battles.
It's just
on the Muslim side.
It's
Yeah.
just a wonderful film, Cameron, and I don't know. I just think that it is time for a remake. It is time
It
for a
is.
remake.
It is. And what I pitched to these people in Qatar that didn't work out is, I had a 3-movie like Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? That I had structured to write. The first movie would follow the birth of Islam until essentially the first major battle that the Muslims won, against the Meccans, which is like, wow, how did this happen, right? And then the second movie, it's sort of like, the return. The second movie is where things go wrong, where the other battles that they lost, where Hamza is killed, where everything seems to be going wrong for them, right? And then out of that, they find triumph, and the second movie ends with them they survive this massive invasion. The Meccans sent a massive final invasion attack before the peace treaty, right? That should have defeated the Muslims. They basically gathered up everybody and they invaded, and they were shocked because when they arrived in Medina, the Prophet had one of his followers was Iranian. So, he was an Iranian who had arrived there. Mostly these are Arabs, but he was Persian. He was Iranian. And the Prophet's coming with all kinds of like defense strategies. They're coming in. Maybe we can hold them at the pass, whatever. And then he had this plan, and this Iranian, follower. We call them companions. We don't even call them followers. We don't call them disciples. They're Prophet's friends. They're called his companions, right? And he said, "Is this plan from you, or is it from God? Did you come up with this military strategy?" And the Prophet said, "Yeah, this is me. I didn't get any revelation from Gabriel. This is how I think we can defend the city." He goes, "Oh, if it's just from you, then can I give you another alternative?" This is amazing of this. They think this man is the prophet of God, but they're like, "Is this from you? If it's from you, then I have a better version." And so they come up with this thing where he basically, he comes up with, in Iran, when we're facing a siege, we build massive ditches, sort of like the Byzantines. And so the Arabs had never even heard of it. They never even imagined it. So this prophet's like, "That's brilliant. That's what we do." And again, this is the prophet goes, "Forget my plan. This guy's right." And they build this massive trench around Mecca. And the Arab army, or the Meccan army arrives like, "What's this?" They don't know how to cross it. They don't know what to do, right? It's like that trench that existed in the, Constantinople.
Yes.
They had no military strategy for it. And so the second movie would end at that moment where this climactic thing where you have the two armies facing, and you don't know what's going to happen, right? And it's like, how are they going to cross this trench, right? And the third movie would be the final moments and the peaceful conquest of Mecca and what goes on beyond that. That's the trilogy that I wanted to write, but they weren't the right partners for it.
Well, Cameron, I have a feeling you will get that trilogy made.
God willing, inshallah, as we say.
And Cameron, I just have to say it's been such a pleasure talking about this film that I think everyone should watch. It certainly is. It is historical, but boy, it's fantastic to watch. It's enjoyable. It is true, that there are some difficult parts, but honestly, it's entertaining. And I wasn't expecting that. Honestly, Cameron, I didn't know.
It's a good movie. It's objectively a great movie.
It's excellent, and I think it's very interesting to remember that this film being made in the 1970s, as I said, at a time where I feel that it was kind of the height, maybe the 50s through the 70s, the height of religious films that featured religion in general, where we kind of maybe aren't getting so much of that anymore in the Western world, perhaps internationally.
It's a tragedy, and it will change.
Yes,
because there's a market for it. If these guys can get over their own pathology of lecturing that market about what they should believe.
Exactly. And, because that whole fantasy has kind of ruined, kind of the entertainment business, if you will. But to be honest with you, Cameron, I have a feeling that your trilogy will be made. Guys, if you're watching, you have not watched The Message before, please do check this film out. It's available in a number of sources. I'm not going to say where I watch mine, but if you query on the internet, you'll find a source.
It's available on Amazon. If you want to give Jeff Bezos some money, it's available. You can download it there. Yeah, so.
Okay. And of course, I want to thank Tom Jr. Jackson, my moderator. This is his channel link right here at the bottom. Subscribe and like to his channel, but also subscribe and like to my channel as well. If you enjoyed today's what was just maybe one of the best streams I've ever done. Also, guys, please join Cameron's Patreon. Cameron has the most incredible Patreon. I am subscribed to it. I love your Patreon, Cameron. And I also do want to mention that Cameron is the creator of the Pasha method of writing. Guys, if you want to write, if you want to start a screenplay, if you want to start a story, but you don't know where to begin, check out Cameron's Pasha method.
Which I post every month on the Patreon. I renew every time. And people are always like, oh my God, this changed my life. Yes.
It really is wonderful. Kamran doesn't hold anything back. There's everything you need there. Kamran has even offered himself, if you need to consult with him, you can pay him for
Yeah,
those
if you have a writing project, I have rates that I put on there. You can consult
Yes.
me. So yeah.
So, he's within reach, a very kind man as well. I have to say, a very talented and kind person, a good friend of mine. Kamran, we already know where to reach you on Patreon. Do
Yeah.
you have any last things that you would like to say about this extraordinary film, a story that has changed human history about the prophet and the message? What are your final thoughts?
Well, I think the important message is this. This movie has become. It initially was very Muslims were skeptical of it. They didn't know if it was going to be blasphemous. A lot of Muslims resisted it, and then in the 40 years since this movie has come out, approaching 50 years now, in the 50 years that this movie has come out, it has become a beloved film in the Muslim world. It went from skepticism to full embrace, and so pretty much most Muslims have a copy or DVD or somewhere in their home, right? And it's something you show your children. And again, it's the one time ever this has been done, and it's very, very moving. But what I would like is the people who are not Muslim watch this. No one is asking you to accept the theological claims. You don't need to. What you need to do is understand that a substantial portion of the world of history was shaped by these events, and that this is how Muslims see their events. And one of the most important things I've learned is that empathy does not require embracing the other person's point of view. It requires understanding the other person's point of view. I've studied all the world's religions. I've studied Buddhism. I've studied Hinduism. I've studied Judaism. I've studied Christianity. Great respect for all of them. Some people would say I understand a lot of these religions better than a lot of the people that at least follow them on the surface, right? I'm very happy with my own path, right? But it's very important for me to see how people of another point of view see themselves. And especially if you've been raised with a critical view of Islam and a critical view of Muhammad as a villain, which he's been portrayed because he was seen as a competitor. Unlike the Abyssinians embraced Muhammad as a brother, no problem, right? You have a different theology, but it's okay. You love Jesus, we love Jesus. It's good enough. The Byzantines, which were the Romans, killed the Muslims and then lost everything. So the Western culture has been defined by how the Romans saw things. And so the Romans saw Islam as a threat, right? And that's what led to the Crusades and everything else. So if you see this as a threatening religion, and if you see Muhammad as a villainous figure, just watch the movie and then understand how he is perceived and why these events are perceived by a quarter of humanity. No one's asking you to believe the truth of any of these spiritual claims. You don't watch the Ten Commandments and have to believe the Red Sea split open. That's personal faith, right? But it helps you understand why these stories matter to people. And so when you've got people like, unfortunately, I'm going to say this, it's a very tragic thing in the West that it's become very fashionable to insult Muhammad. It's fashionable amongst progressive terms, and it's hidden behind the love of free speech. Here, I'm going to make a cartoon mocking Muhammad, right? I'm going to say these horrible things about him. And I'm going to do that to incite you to get angry at me. And so that we're going to show how anti-free speech you are. Well, it's like this. It's like you have every right to insult my mother and call her bad names on free speech. However, you will hurt people by doing that. And what good have you accomplished by that? When someone insults people that you love. So this coolness of insulting Muhammad today, which has become certainly cool amongst people who are threatened by him religiously, both amongst religious people and amongst atheists and secularists. If you see what he means to people, the incredible love and devotion of the message that he spread, right? Maybe you would understand why that's not the best way to build friendships with people. Insulting their holy figures. The Quran tells us, the Quran actually says this. There's a verse in the Quran that says, God says, do not curse their gods. And you talk about the pagan gods of Mecca. Do not curse their gods. Do not curse their gods, because then they will foolishly curse God and bring sin upon themselves, right? So it's like, don't curse their gods. We Muslims are prohibited from mocking other people's religions. Is a verse in the Quran. So I would urge you, you don't have to share anyone's faith, but understand their point of view and then respect what that means to them. And then we can build human connections.
Yeah, well said, Kamran. And I do want to say that this is one of the best films I think I've ever seen.
Yeah, it really is.
It really, they thought about a lot of things. It could have been very preachy, Kamran. They could have done that. But something that I noticed about this film is that the sequences where there's one segment, this is the last thing I'm going to say. There's a few segments where they start to recite passages, and it's absolutely beautiful. In fact, It's one of the most beautiful parts in the movie. And of course, it's just a snippet of the, these everyone spreading the message, so to
Yeah.
speak. But Cameron, it was done so beautifully. I can just imagine what I've obviously I wasn't there, but I can just imagine how those first lucky people got to hear the message. Let's say initially the first groups of people who heard that and were just so mesmerized by what they were hearing. It sounds wonderful now. Certainly, do guys check out the message. Support Cameron here. This is
Please.
his Patreon link. And I also want to say on Friday, guys,
Mhm.
Friday morning, please join me and Darth Plato here on Positive Fandom for my review of Napoleon and Josephine, a love story. Also, on Friday at 5 p.m. on the Burn Network, everybody, I'm going to be premiering a program that I did with Cameron, with Retro Nerd Girl and Lorena Creole. It is PGS Moving Image, our review of the IP of Planet of the Apes.
Oh, yes. And I participate in that.
Yes, Cameron, you were there as well, of course, and it was such a wonderful discussion. It's going to be premiering on the Burn Network at 5 p.m. Eastern on Friday. So, guys, please also do check that out. I do want to mention that since Cameron is here. And Cameron, I do want to thank you so much for joining me. We are enjoying these wonderful reviews we're doing. We've got to find more things to review. I have some other ideas, but of course, if you have
Well, you're the first person that's wanted to review this movie. I've mentioned it before, and again, people haven't heard of it. They think it's what are the odds it's going to be any good, and it's one of the greatest movies ever made. And so, it really means a lot to me that you reviewed this movie and that you allowed me to share my thoughts with you.
Well, it means a lot to me too. As you know, as I said, I did my research work in Ethiopia. So I had no idea, see, I knew that all three religions were there, Cameron. It's just that I didn't know the history. And this really makes this film even more special to me because I do love Ethiopia. So, and the history there. And this was such an important part of their history as well. And the history of the world, a film that changed the world forever, everybody. You can't say that about any other, well, very few
very few films, present a new form of art and then inspired an entire civilization that, it's not common. And this is the one of them that did.
And I also want to thank Tom Jr. Jackson. Guys, subscribe to Tom Jr. Jackson's channel.
Absolutely, please.
We're all good people, Tom. And for everybody in the chat, Abu Nas, thank you for your generous super chat. I so do appreciate that. For everybody out there, no matter where you are in the galaxy, always do remember to please be kind. Take care, everybody. Bye.